Okay, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, my country fellows, good morning to all the friends in the US and good evening to all the friends in China. My name is Denton Boynton. I'm the current president of the Sino-American Educational Research Association, SAERA. On behalf of the SAERA Executive Board, I welcome you all to love, unity, peace, and hope for the betterment of the global village, the first US-China non-governmental public forum series on international collaboration in the era of pandemic. We just had a very successful opening last week on July 4th, and today is our first forum will be given by Dr. Carol Lee. So our gathering, our event, is a very socially, historically meaningful event. It's a celebration of unity as well as diversity, bringing people of diverse languages, countries, ethnicities, and experiences together. Today, it is true that the pandemic has imposed a great challenge on all of us. And it is true that it has impacted all of us enormously, our job, our family, our daily lives, our future. But I believe we always have a choice in terms of what we can do when faced with a challenge. So this is the reason we are hosting this event. We hope through this event, we can shape people's attitudes and their expectations and also their actions. And we can work together, united, to make this world a better place. 好，女士们、先生们、同事们、朋友们，在美国的朋友们，大家早上好；在中国的朋友们，大家晚上好。我是邓婷博彦顿，是中美教育研究协会 SAERA 会长。首先呢，我谨代表 SAERA 执行委员会的全体成员，热烈欢迎大家出席。首届爱、团结、和平、希望，共建和谐美丽地球村首届全球疫情背景下中美非政府民间国际共同战役的系列论坛。今天我们的聚会具有重大的历史意义和社会意义，是一个团结与多元的庆祝会，大将不同的语言、不同的国家、不同种族和不同经验的人们聚集在一起。好，大家知道呢，新冠疫情给我们带来了巨大的挑战，也给我们带来了巨大的影响。它影响了我们的工作、我们的生活、我们的家庭、我们的未来。但是我相信，就面对如何面对挑战而言，我们始终拥有选择的权利。这也是为什么我们举办本次活动，是希望能够团结一心，全球人民共同抗疫。好，为了节省时间，在我们介绍完Carol Lee 博士之后呢，我们会整场活动都是以英语来进行，然后呢，中文呢，我们以字幕的形式提供给大家。All right, I just explained to you, to everybody, because due to the time limit, we are going to just run the whole event in English, and then we will provide the Chinese as subtitles. Okay, first, please allow me to introduce Dr. Carol Lee. 首先呢，请允许介绍一下今天的嘉宾 Carol Lee 博士。Because the bio is very long, I'm going to just select some highlights. Okay, Dr. Carol Lee is a professor emeritus of education in the School of Education and Social Policy and in African American Studies at the Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, USA. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago. She's the past president of American Educational Research Association, AERA. AERA is past representative to the World Educational Research Association, past vice president of Division G, Social Context of Education of the American Educational Research Association, past president of the National Conference of Research in Language and Literacy, and past co-chair of the Research Assembly of the National Council of the Teachers of English. She's a member of the National Academy of Education in the United States, the American Academy of Arts and Science, a fellow of American Education Research Association, a fellow of the National Conference on Research in Language and Literacy, and a former fellow at the Center of Advanced Studies in the Behavior Science. She's the recipient of Distinguished Service Award from the National Council of Teachers of English, Scholar of Color Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Educational Research Association, the Water Award for Research Excellence at the Northwestern University, the Distinguished Alumni Award from the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Illinois, Urbana. The President's President's Award from the American Association of Blacks in Higher Education, Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of the Colleges of Teacher Education, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Pretoria, South Africa. As I said, Dr. Carol Lee is a very distinguished scholar and a very accomplished educator. It is truly our honor to have Dr. Lee joining us today. 那我很快的把Carol Lee 博士的中文简介呢跟大家分享一下，因为他的这个简介非常的长啊，他是一位非常有名的、有成就的一个学者和一位专家啊，所以呢我们非常的荣幸能够有Carol Lee 博士今天来加入我们。Carol Lee 博士呢现在是西北大学教育与社会政策学院的一位教授，以及非裔美国人研究学院的名誉教授。他是芝加哥大学的博士，是美国教育研究协会 AERA 的前任主席，是美国教育研究协会在世界教育研究协会的前任代表，美国教育研究协会季峰会教育社会背景的前副主席，美国国家教育学会的前任主席，语言与扫盲研究会议曾担任国家英语教师委员会研究会的联席主席，是美国国家教育学院、美国艺术与科学学院的成员，美国教育研究协会的研究员，全国语言与素养研究会议的研究员，以及行为科学高级研究中心，曾经获得美国国家英语教师委员会的杰出服务奖，美国教育研究协会有色人种研究的杰出学者奖，西北大学的沃登杰出研究奖，自由大学的杰出校友奖等等等等。好，时间关系呢，我就不一一的列举。今天呢，我们还有一位非常重要的嘉宾，非常重磅的嘉宾，这个是在昨天才确认的啊，就是美国教育研究协会的现任会长Sean Harper 博士呢，会担任我们今天论坛的一个点评员。So today we actually have a very, very distinguished scholar, the current president of American Educational Research Association, Dr. Sean Harper, will be served as a discussant for Dr. Carol Lee's talk. We just confirmed yesterday, so haven't got the chance to make the news to the whole community yet. So I'm going to quickly introduce Dr. Sean Harper. Dr. Sean Harper studies racial, gender, and LGBT issues in corporations, law firms, Hollywood production companies, K-12 schools, and universities. He's also an expert on college sports. Dr. Harper has consulted with more than 200 business and institutions on strategies related to unity, diversity, and inclusion. He has published 12 books and over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and other academic publications, and produced 13 million in research grants. His research has been cited over 10,000 published studies. The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Fortune, Washington Post, Black Enterprise, and several thousand other news outlets have quoted Professor Harper and featured his research. He has interviewed on CNN, ESPN, and NPR. Prior to becoming a faculty member, he was assistant director of MBA admission for the Indiana University College School of Business. Dr. Harper spent a decade at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was tenured full professor. 好，接下来我们把我们今天的点评员 Sean Harper 博士呢做一个简单的介绍。我们今天非常的荣幸呢，邀请到了美国教育研究协会的现任会长 Sean Harper 博士担任 Carol Lee 博士的点评员。Sean Harper 博士呢，是在 K-12 学校和大学中研究种族、性别和 LGBT 的问题，还是大学体育方面的一个专家。他已经出版了已经跟200多家企业和机构就公平、多元化和包容性战略进行咨询，出版了12本书，发表了100多篇同行评审的期刊文章和其他学术版物，获得了1300万美元 的研究基金、科研经费，他的研究被1万多项已经发表的研究引用曾经在《华尔街日报》、《纽约时报》、《财富》杂志、《华盛顿邮报》、黑人企业以及其他数千个新闻媒体都被引用，介绍他的研究成果。他也曾经接受 CNN、ESPN 和 NPR 的采访。在成为教育工作者之前呢，曾经是印第安纳大学凯利商学院 MBA 的招生主任。哈珀博士呢，在宾夕法尼亚大学任职10年，是现任宾夕法尼亚大学的终身教授。好，我们掌声欢迎2位。接下来呢，我们就会把话筒交给我们的 Carol 李博士。Okay, so next, Carol, are you ready? I'm going to turn the microphone to you, and you can do the screen sharing. We're going to officially start. 再次提醒大家呢，在整个过程当中全程静音。如果有什么问题有什么评论的话呢，可以在我们的对话框中打出来。我们有很多志愿者，有很多的问题，重要的问题呢，会把它挑出来，然后呢转给我，好吗 ？Okay, all right, let's get started.
All right. First, let me thank Dr. Boynton for this invitation. I had the honor, was it a year, maybe 2 years ago, to come and visit with colleagues from the Sino-American Educational Research Association in Wuhan. I had the honor 2 years ago. All right, the title of my talk is Race and the COVID Pandemic, Lessons for Humanity, Light in the Darkness. So I want to first start with just a general overview of the overarching points that I will be seeking to make during this talk. First, that the COVID pandemic reveals persistent inequities within and across nation states, and that the challenges that we face in light of this pandemic provide us with an opportunity to examine underlying worldwide challenges around how we understand cultural differences. These complexities around conceptions of race, as illustrated in the experience of peoples of African descent in the United States, offer us conceptual tools for interrogating conceptions of difference in other parts of the world. This history of peoples of African descent in the United States also show the power of individual acts to shape history in the midst of darkness, and so in the midst of trauma, and thus the title of this talk is Light in the Midst of Darkness. This is going to be interesting. The COVID pandemic in the United States has had great differences and impacts across ethnic communities. This recent data from the Center for Disease Prevention shows that Native Americans, African Americans, Latinx populations are 4 to 5 times more likely to have severity of infections that require them to enter hospitals than whites or Asian and Pacific Islanders. These differences can be explained by a number of factors: less access to health care, greater community instances of underlying diseases, such as heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and exposure to environmental toxins. The COVID pandemic has spread across the globe. Across the globe, it tends to be the case that those who are the most poor experience the greatest devastations. In many countries, greater levels of poverty are associated with ethnic differences within countries. In this section, I try to illustrate how ethnic diversity is common across countries. This ethnic diversity is sometimes due to how the borders of nations shift over time, but this diversity is also an outgrowth of patterns of migration. At the same time, it is important to recognize how common artifacts, technologies, and businesses travel across national boundaries. This report is from the World Migration Report. It shows similarities and differences in migration patterns in the last 20 years. The estimated number of international migrants has almost doubled. The presence of women and children who are migrants has remained relatively stable. The number of internally displaced persons and stateless persons has also significantly grown. Understanding these migration patterns is important for how we understand the challenges of the COVID pandemic, particularly in terms of how nations respond to these patterns of migration and the kinds of ethnic diversity that they include. I recall my first visit to China some 2 decades ago when I was shocked to find Kentucky Fried Chicken in Beijing. At the same time, the many instances of Chinatown communities in the United States and Walmart in China illustrate how ideas, practices, goods, and services travel across national boundaries. This is further illustration of how connected we are across national borders. We depend on one another in good times and bad times. The COVID virus knows no borders. Hip hop in China embodies the power of African American culture in moving across the globe. Chinatowns in the United States represent how important ethnic traditions and histories are in spite of patterns of migration. Again, we live in an interconnected world. Ethnic diversity is more the norm than homogeneity. Here we have examples of ethnic minority communities and nations that are often thought to be homogeneous. So in Taiwan, for example, we have the indigenous population in Taiwan. There are over 52 ethnic minorities, including those in the autonomous regions, such as the Uyghurs in China. In Singapore, the Malay. In Germany, they're Turkish immigrants. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples and recent immigrants. In New Zealand, the Maori. In the United States, of course, people of African descent, and actually people from across the world. Ethnic minority status is complicated by a number of issues. One is the history of incorporation into the nation states, how different ethnic minorities become part of nation states whose lines and borders shift over time. So in the United States, how African Americans and Native Americans became incorporated into the nation state matters for their standing and their challenges. Also, geographic history of the nation influences how ethnic minorities come into being in different nations. In the United States, for example, the United States was able to secure portions of the South through the Louisiana Purchase, purchasing land from Napoleon of France that gave the country access to southern ports for commerce, which is one reason that it was so important to the US to make that purchase, to make that connection. The Louisiana Purchase, however, was made possible in part by the war against France by Blacks in Haiti to free themselves from slavery. The ethnic white and Black populations of the Louisiana region are influenced by the Louisiana Purchase. About 62% of the population identifies as white, which includes German, British, Irish, and Italian influences, as well as Creoles and Cajuns who maintain their strong French heritage. Another 33% identify as Black, which includes African Americans of various Americans speaking English, Spanish, and French cultural influence. There are also issues having to do with language variation that come up in terms of ethnic minority status within nations. The question of maintaining different language traditions that are associated with different ethnic groups plays out in many countries. In China, for example, with some 52 ethnic groups speaking different languages. In Singapore, excuse me, with the Malay, Tamil, English, and Mandarin China. In in Spain, you have Castilian Spanish, Catalan, Galician, and Basque, just to name a few. Cultural practices, belief systems, and social networks that sustain ethnicity within nation states are also important. So there are many states in which people must navigate between the expectations of ethnic identity and the expectations of the nation state. The United States and China share several interesting similarities. First, they are both multi-ethnic. I would say in the United States, we tend to think of China as being homogenous and don't recognize the ethnic and linguistic diversity in China. And in a similar vein, as one can see from the slide, there is tremendous ethnic diversity within the United States as well. For many in the United States, China is viewed as ethnically homogeneous country. Because of this ethnic and linguistic diversity in both China and the United States, thinking about how each country wrestles with its diversity and how this wrestling plays out in different social, economic, and educational outcomes, and as well as out of, excuse me, start again. Thinking about how each country wrestles with its diversity and how this wrestling plays out in different social, economic, and educational outcomes is important in terms of thinking about outcomes related to the COVID pandemic. So it's thinking about these conundrums across nation states to investigate the possible lessons to be learned that can only help the world think about navigating this pandemic and those that are to come. Because again, it's important to understand this is the most recent, but there certainly have been pandemics across human history. So yes, ethnicity plays out in the unfolding of this COVID virus across the world. In the United States, and indeed in other parts of the world, the idea of race is often not sufficiently interrogated in terms of its relationship to the idea of ethnicity. It's important to recognize that race is a social and political construct, that it has no basis in biology. Race cannot be biologically defined due to genetic variation among human individuals and populations. In fact, there is more diversity within groups than across groups. Race is defined in very different ways, for example, in the United States, Brazil, South Africa, and South Africa. And it's also important to remember that race is a relatively new concept in human history. We also know that human communities originally evolved in Southern Africa and over time dispersed across the globe. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is defined by cultural practices and belief systems that human communities sustain across time and space. An important book that documents the history of the idea of race and how it has been used to colonize and subjugate populations across the world is Charles Mills' The Racial Contract. He shows with clear and convincing historical documents how conceptions of racial hierarchies, placing those identified as white at the top of the ladder and those groups, supposedly racial groups, at the bottom, were used to provide moral warrants for acts of aggression, colonization, and enslavement. In earlier times of racial exploitation, statements, policies, and actions that positioned people who were not considered white as inferior were explicit. However, in much of the modern world, such explicit statements are considered not politically correct. However, these racial biases continue to manifest themselves implicitly rather than explicitly. However, even when they are implicit, they are understood by those in power and those who are disenfranchised. Because of this, learning how to navigate and resist negative stereotypes around race pose important life course challenges for everyone, but particularly for those who are positioned negatively around race. It is interesting to examine who gets to be placed in one racial category or another over time. This is particularly interesting in the United States. There were times in the early 1900s when people from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, who migrated to the United States were not considered white. In fact, there's a book called When the Irish Became White. In the photograph here, the boy with the blonde hair is from the Solomon Islands and has no European ancestry to account for his blonde hair. And while conceptions of race has in Western pseudoscience and in Western philosophy tried to argue that Black people, persons of African descent, have less intelligence and do not value learning, the photograph of the old man tells a different story. He was born in slavery in the United States. He is clearly deeply poor, but he holds what he values most, a book. And so race in the United States, South and Central America, Europe, and other parts of the world, race has been used as a justification for creating barriers to opportunity and lack of access to resources. This is one of the reasons COVID in the United States has so negatively impacted people of color. I now want to proceed to talk specifically about issues of race in the United States, particularly focusing on the kinds of contradictions that this construct of race continues to pose for our country. The United States faces a complex dilemma. It is a dilemma that also faces many countries in the world that publicly call for democratic government, articulating ideas that call for all people to have equality. That dilemma is the difference between goals stated in historical and political documents and a history of practices that represent the exact opposite. In the United States, that dilemma grows from the fact that it is a nation born out of two Holocausts: the genocide against the indigenous populations who occupied the land before the Europeans came, and the 400 years of enslavement and legal apartheid of peoples of African descent within the nation. At the same time, the founders of the country created a complex model of democratic decision-making, perhaps among the most powerful of such models in human history. Trying to navigate the legacies of these two Holocausts with the lofty goals articulated in its Constitution, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is the American experiment, is the American dilemma. I seek across this talk to highlight interesting points of intersection between the United States and China. One is the presence in both countries of autonomous ethnic groups who have unique histories in terms of their relations with the nation state. In both countries, these complex histories and relationships yield tensions and sources of inequality. There are both autonomous regions in China and the United States. The autonomous regions in the United States are regions of indigenous American Indian nations that have formal legal status with the US government. It's useful to note that among the groups most negatively impacted by this current COVID virus in the United States are, in fact, tribal nations. African Americans suffered under legal slavery for some 200 years. After the US Civil War and the passing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, African Americans were legally free. However, following a brief period when African Americans were able to exert political power, called Reconstruction, the nation reverted to another 200-year period of what was called Jim Crow. Jim Crow was essentially legal apartheid, similar to legal apartheid in South Africa, which interestingly enough has a much shorter history in South Africa than in the United States. Besides slavery as forced labor, it is also a practice of extreme cruelty, as evident in the photograph of the man with the scarred back, beaten repeatedly for any number of reasons. An important question for thinking about hope for the future, then, is to understand how is it that human beings, that human communities can learn so deeply to hate. However, despite the violence of slavery African Americans maintained hope, struggled for freedom, developed their own institutions to meet their needs, including establishing their own schools. At the end of the Civil War, African Americans established hundreds of schools across the South, schools that they ran, which they taught, and that they financially supported. In fact, the noted scholar W.E.B. Du Bois has argued that public education for poor whites in the South was influenced by efforts of African Americans to convince local governments to pay for public education. So I've spoken a lot about the power of ethnicity, the idea that groups of people sustain cultural practices, belief systems, and systems of relationships over time. People of African descent make up an ethnic group that has dispersed across the globe through both forced and voluntary migration. They can be found on virtually every continent in the world, and we refer to this as the African diaspora. What is powerful about this African diaspora is that despite every effort to destroy any vestiges of African culture, they have sustained what Dr. Wade Boykin of Howard University calls deep culture. These cultural continuities can be found in the United States, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, virtually every country in Central and South America. It's important to note, for example, that there are more Black people in Brazil than in the United States. These cultural continuities include the centrality of rhythm, of the drum, of beliefs in the extended family, of valuing relationships between ancestors, those living on top of the earth and the unborn. They are reflected in ways of using language despite speaking different national languages. These traditions have been sustained across generations, across time and space, despite efforts to destroy them. And so the pictures that you see are pictures coming from across the African diaspora, where we will again see continuities in terms of practices and belief systems. The image above is a photograph of a memorial monument built in Wall Street in New York City. It is a monument that recognizes that Wall Street, the center of capitalist business in the United States, was once an African burial ground in the 1600s and on. Enslaved Africans buried their dead there. The Black community in New York and around the country organized and protested in order to have this acknowledged as sacred ground. These efforts were led by the Schomburg Center for Black Culture in New York City, along with other community organizations. The Schomburg Center is an interesting example of Pan-African roots. It was founded by a Black Puerto Rican named Arturo Schomburg, who devoted his life during the 1930s to collecting books and cultural artifacts that reflected the African experience in the US and Puerto Rico. As part of the efforts to build the monument, archaeologists from Howard University dug up remains. As expected, they found that people had been in dire health. However, what they did not expect was how people were buried, in positions with markings on the body and amulets that identified them as Yoruba, as Iwe, as members of specific ethnic African communities from the continent of Africa. Their findings served as evidence that these enslaved people never forgot they were African, that they sought to make sure the world would know as they transitioned into eternity who they were, that they were not slaves. I point to this history as evidence of how cultural belief systems and practices sustained to support resilience in the face of extreme trauma, in fact, are powerful, and that understanding such cultural resources can serve us today as we figure out how communities can survive and navigate this current pandemic. This image serves several purposes. First, it is a historical photograph taken during slavery. It shows people who, despite enslavement, see themselves as a community. It shows their strength. The United Nations declared in 2011 that this was the International Year for People of African Descent, promoting and acknowledging the unity of peoples of Africa across the globe. This unity among Africans across the diaspora is reflected in the history of what are called the Pan-African Congresses. There were 6 Pan-African Congresses taking place between 1901 and 1945. Representatives from the United States, the Caribbean, South and Central America, and Africa met across this time period to plan and collaborate to resist colonization. These efforts, for example, led to the independence movement that resulted in the independence of Ghana in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, who attended the Pan-African Congress in 1945, attended a Black U.S. university, and met and was mentored by W.E.B. Du Bois. There is also a long history of relations between Africans in the Americas and the continent of Africa. Examples include the establishment of Freetown in Sierra Leone, the establishment of the state of Liberia, and the Back to Africa movement, associated in the 20th century with Marcus Garvey, but which preceded him by over 100 years. The Organization of African Unity in the current modern era has established what they call the 6th region to represent Africans outside of the continent. Another example is in a country like Brazil, where Brazil made the decision to require the inclusion of Afro-Brazilian and African history in the curriculum of all schools. So I have briefly traced this history of race, this history of cultural continuities over time and space of peoples of African descent as an illustration of a big idea. I have sought to make the case that in this era of global pandemic, a pandemic which has impacted particular groups of people most adversely, requires as researchers that we focus on understanding what can contribute to human resilience in the face of extreme trauma. And I argue here that the histories of peoples of African descent, for me with a special focus on peoples of African descent living in the United States, offer a window for reflection. Donald Stokes wrote a book called Postur's Quadrant. In it, he offers a history of traditions in basic research in the sciences. Basic research here is defined as a quest for fundamental understandings of some phenomena. He distinguishes between what he calls pure basic research and use-inspired basic research. He uses Louis Pasteur's work on discoveries of the principles of vaccination, microbial fermentation, and pasteurization address a basic scientific question, but one in search of a use for public good. We have this opportunity in this time of turmoil on so many levels to engage as research communities in work that helps us understand foundational principles about human learning and development that can be recruited in service of supporting resilience across communities in these troubling times. So I've tried so far to offer illustrations of such resilience in the face of trauma among peoples of African descent, particularly in the context of the United States. Whether we look at the enslavement of Africans in the United States and across the Caribbean as well as South and Central America, or the devastation of indigenous communities across the Americas, Australia and New Zealand, or the Holocaust of the Second World War against Jews, the Roma, homosexuals, and others, we find stories of resistance, lived examples of resilience. What these histories tell us is that it is not simply the nature of challenges we face, but rather the relationships between those challenges and the kinds of support that are available to us. I've tried to illustrate how belief systems, perceptions of the self, relationships, and sustained cultural practices can and have served as supports in the face of challenge, in the face of trauma. In this age of pandemic, the questions are both understanding the challenges posed as well as the resources available. Some of these resources emerge from the practices of nation states, from the collaborations across nation states, as well as from the collaborations and relationships among peoples of the world that move across border. And certainly this symposium series is one example. Margaret Beale Spencer of the University of Chicago has developed a framework she calls PVES, Phenomenological Variant of Ecological Systems Theory. In it, she argues that developmental outcomes are an outgrowth of relations between the nature of challenges we face and the supports that are available. It is common for us to think about those who experience the greatest trauma as those most vulnerable, and to think about the affluent, for example, as not vulnerable. However, Dr. Spencer has created this matrix to highlight the vulnerability faced by those who have low risk, but also low supports. She argues that this group can be characterized as having what she calls masked vulnerability, because even though on the face they seem to experience low risk, they have often not been tested. And because they also have low supports, are all the more vulnerable. One example I often cite is during the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States. It was more common for the rich to commit suicide than the poor. The overall argument here is that to understand trajectories of resilience or trajectories of negative life outcomes, we must understand human development in its ecological context. That means what people experience in the multiple immediate settings in which they participate matter. Relationships across those settings matter. This graphic represents the idea of ecological systems most associated with the work of Dr. Uri Bronfenbrenner. In this model, not only does participation in particular communities of practice matter, but also where in time matters. Where in the life course one is as an infant, a child, adult, or an elder, when in cultural historical time experiences occur. For example, differences in the pandemic experience in 1918 of the influenza virus in the United States versus the so-called Black Death pandemic. In this next section, I want to argue and illustrate the power of artifacts to carry ideas across time and space. Particularly in this, our modern age, technologies in particular facilitate the production and spread of ideas across the globe. It's interesting to think about how the production of cultural artifacts within and across states embody knowledge, points of view, and hold the power to influence. Social media is hugely influential across the globe. In the 2016 presidential election in the United States, there is convincing evidence that foreign countries, specifically Russia, created social media ads intended to influence the election. Several things are interesting about these examples here. First, as social media productions, they are widely accessible. But what is interesting is how each artifact captures in it a representation of a source of tension and conflict within the United States, politics, and culture. Each illustrates the power of image as artifact to capture and manipulate points of view. How they are taken up, how they were in fact taken up in the United States depends on the critical literacies consumers bring to such acts of interpretation. If viewers believed in the stereotypes, they believed in the messages of the ads. One question may be how we think about creating multimedia artifacts that travel across nation states, that can embody and promote beliefs about international collaboration, about our joint humanity, about the needs to find ways to address those struggling most among us, regardless of nation states. It's interesting to note how these politically provoked ads play on tensions around race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation within the United States. In this slide, I offer an interesting and compelling example of how artifacts, here images, can inspire and speak to one another across time and space. On the left is the cover of the June 2020 issue of the magazine Rolling Stone. It is a cover developed by a Black artist to capture the spirit of the protest movement in the United States against police brutality against African Americans. It shows a strong Black woman with a fist reached out, a historical symbol of Black power from the 1960s, wearing a t-shirt with an image of George Floyd, the Black man whose killing by Minneapolis police has inspired mass protests in the United States and across the globe. This struggle she leads is intergenerational, with a Black boy at her side, symbolizing the continuity of the struggle across generations. Behind her is a multi-ethnic, multi-racial community of people who are engaged in this prolonged struggle. The artist, Kadir Nelson, says he was explicitly inspired by Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, the iconic 1830 painting that depicts a woman leading the French Revolution. I wanted to create something in a similar vein that would have been the same feeling and celebrate this tipping point in our history, he says. These images speak to one another across time and space, capturing the power of women to lead, capturing the spirit of fighting for freedom. Each in its own time and space inspires community organizing and influences the trajectories of history. To further illustrate the power of human-created artifacts to carry and influence history, I offer these two images. The first is the cover of the New Yorker magazine of June 2020. It is an image again of George Floyd, whose murder is only among the most recent examples of racist terror against Black people. On this broad body are images of others across US history who have suffered such terrors, such as children killed by racists, such as the death of Emmett Till in 1956 and the shooting of Trayvon Martin in 2012. The power of resistance of Dr. Martin Luther King and Minister Malcolm X, who were politically assassinated. And then the images of the brutality of slavery from the bows of the ships that carried Africans as cargoes to the so-called New World, to the scarred back of an enslaved man. This powerful image carries history. It conveys power and resilience in the face of persistent and sustained trauma. And it is an image on the New Yorker magazine, which will be viewed around the world, conveying power and resilience, conveying hope and possibility. The second image is from Washington, D.C. After peaceful protesters were violently rebuffed near the US White House, the home of the President of the United States, the mayor of Washington, D.C. asserted the rights of the Washington, D.C. government to protest the actions taken by the federal government. She had painted in huge yellow lettering, Black Lives Matter, as a symbolic stance against the actions of the federal government in pushing against the rights of peaceful protests guaranteed by the US Constitution. That public lettering served as another example of a public artifact, a public image created to carry power, to push back against oppression. A similar image has just been created in New York City in front of the Trump Tower with direct participation by the mayor of New York City. So I've tried to illustrate across this talk what we can learn about resilience in the face of trauma from African Americans. I have also argued that our resilience in the face of historical trauma provide useful lessons for sources of resilience as communities wrestling with their own forms of diversity challenges face this worldwide COVID pandemic. In this final section of my talk, I want to offer examples of the power of individual action. So often we think to address great societal and world problems, we can only influence by broader group efforts. While this is certainly true that organized social action is powerful and necessary, it is also the case that we as individuals can also influence history. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the detail that I had planned, but I offer just these two examples from African American history of individuals who actions of individuals have been very consequential. We certainly all know the work and history of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, but many people don't know that his wife, Anna Murray Douglass, who was born a freed woman, specifically aided him in escaping from slavery. She worked as a laundress and saved her money and was able to sneak to get money to him because of her working in a laundry, was able to get a sailor's outfit for him to use in his escape. And had it not been for the bravery of this act of this one Black woman, Anna Murray, to help in the escape of Frederick Douglass, the whole history of the abolitionist movement in the United States might have been very different. On the other side is a picture of Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells is known as a woman who fought particularly against lynching in the United States. And she actually traveled across the country carrying her baby on her back to argue and fight against lynching in the United States. All of these are people who participated in organized activity, but who made individual decisions about the trajectories of their lives that in fact have changed history. The Black Lives Movement started in response to the pervasive history of brutality against Black people in the United States. Among the most devastating of these was the killing of Trayvon Martin at the age of 17, as he was walking back from the store on his way home to his father's, shot by a white man, George Zimmerman, who claimed he thought Trayvon was an intruder. Zimmerman was not convicted of the murder. And then the murder of 12-year-old Tamir Rice by a white policeman. Someone called the police saying there was a man with a gun. The policeman, upon seeing the 12-year-old boy with a toy gun, shot the boy dead. The police officer not only faced no consequences for shooting, but went on to pursue his career as a policeman in another district. Black Lives Matter was founded by 3 Black women in 2013. Alicia Garza, Patrice Colors, and Opal Tometi. It was founded to organize protests against police brutality against Black people, inspired by prominent cases of Black people, particularly Black men and boys, killed without cause by the police. And again, their individual actions in deciding to come together and form this organization have had impact, in fact, across the world. The protests in response to the killings of George Floyd, inspired and led by the Black Lives Matter organization, with its affiliates across the country, have led to demonstrations in support of Black lives across the globe. In Turkey, Australia, Italy, Poland, Spain, Japan, Denmark, Kenya, Sweden, Brazil, and England. One interesting recurring image across these protests from around the globe is you see Black people, Black presence in all of these countries, light in the midst of the darkness of oppression, light led by Black people. In closing, I offer another example of the power of Black thought and practice to inspire hope and faith in how we can understand the centrality of cooperation across nations, across divergent groups as our tool in these difficult times. The concept of Ubuntu comes from South Africa, shared with the world by Nelson Mandela. He says, a traveler through a country would stop at a village, and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? W.E. Du Bois said in The Problem of the Color Line in the 20th century, we must be prepared in the progress of all reformatory movements for periods of exhalation and depression, of rapid advance and retrogression, of hope and fear. The movement, with all its retrogression, is a spiral, not a circle. As long as there is motion, there is hope. It behooves us then here to study carefully and seek to understand the present social movement in America as far as it affects our interests, and to ask what we can do to ensure the ultimate triumph of right and justice. I'm thinking what I may do now is to close and have Dr. Sean Harper respond, and then we might come back and I can show this little Yes I Can clip perhaps to close our presentation out.